Quake, Disaster in San Francisco, 1906, Chapter 3. Disaster Before Dawn. Jacob pulled back the covers and sat on the edge of his bed to take off his shoes. The dog jumped up and curled into a ball at the foot of the bed. Sliding onto his pillow, Jacob poked his feet out of the blanket and let his toes snuggle against the dog's soft fur. Together they drifted into sleep. The sound of whining woke him. The dog was standing on his bed, tensed as if to run. Propping himself on an elbow, Jacob listened. He thought he could hear another dog barking in the distance. The room was dark and still. His father and sister seemed to be sleeping soundly. Stroking the dog's back, Jacob felt its muscles gradually relax. Finally it settled down and rested its head on Jacob's thigh. Trying not to disturb it, Jacob eased back onto his pillow. No sooner had he dozed off than the dog woke him again. This time it was scratching furiously at the covers as though it was digging a hole in a pile of leaves. "Shh," Jacob said. He listened, trying to decide if the movement had awakened Sophie or Papa. His sister's even breathing told him that she was still asleep, but he couldn't tell about Papa. Jacob leaned close to the dog and patted its head. "Hush, fella," he whispered. The dog sat down, but kept whining. "What's going on, Jacob?" Itzhak asked in a low voice. Jacob felt the dog's body begin to tremble. "Nothing," Jacob said. "He's such a young dog. I guess he misses his mother." Silence. Jacob wished he hadn't said the word mother. He tapped his thigh softly until the dog nosed his hand. He ran his fingers through the fur around the animal's neck. Too tense to fall back to sleep, Jacob stared at the shadows on the ceiling. He wished he could think of something to say, something that would comfort Papa and make him cheerful again, something that would make their family whole again. Jacob must have nodded off because he woke with a start. This time the dog was poking him with its damp nose. When Jacob moved, the dog barked. The sound was sharp and loud, like a bullet in the night. "What's the matter with the dog, Jacob?" Sophie asked. Her voice echoed against the dark walls. "Nothing," Jacob began. "Jacob, that stupid animal has kept me up all night," Itzhak said. "I told you there's something wrong with him." Jacob heard the bed creak as his father sat up. "I'm going to put him outside. He's already woken Sophie up. All we need is for the neighbors to complain." Sophie shot out of bed. "No, Papa, the doggie will get lost. How can he find his way home in the night? He'll be scared." Jacob stroked the dog's ears while Itzhak coaxed Sophie back into bed. "Dogs aren't afraid of the dark," his father told her in a soothing voice, "because they see with their noses. This little dog is probably not used to being shut up inside a closed building, so he's nervous. He's used to being outdoors." Itzhak patted Sophie's back. Finally she slipped her thumb into her mouth and closed her eyes. Jacob eased out of bed. "I'll take the dog outside," he whispered. "I guess I should have walked him after supper." He began to slip on his clothes. "Be careful, son," Itzhak said. "It's almost morning, and wagons will already be on the street. The drivers can't see so well in the dark." Jacob nodded. "Maybe I'll walk over to the produce district and wait for Uncle Avy. I'll leave the dog with him." He waited, hoping his father would stop him. But Itzhak did not speak until Jacob opened the door. "It's for the best, son," he said. "You'll see." Jacob picked up the dog and carried it down the steps. He wasn't sure what time it was, but he heard the sounds coming from one or two apartments. Most of the men who lived in the boarding house were laborers. Jacob knew that some of them got up before dawn to go to work. As he opened the outside door, the dog squirmed like a worm on a hook. Then it jumped out of his arms and scrambled onto the street. Jacob could barely keep up as the dog charged down Howard Street. At the corner it began to howl. Jacob squinted, trying to see what the animal was so agitated about. The street lights were on, but he couldn't see anything unusual. He heard other dogs barking in the distance. "Is that why you're so restless, fella?" Jacob said. "Because of all the barking?" The dog cocked its head as Jacob spoke. Then it dropped its chest to the ground, rump in the air, and barked. Leaping up, it ran around Jacob and onto the street. Again Jacob trotted to catch up. At the next corner Jacob could hear horses whinnying. All the animals are skittish, he thought. That's strange. When he reached First Street, Jacob turned north, but the dog darted off in the direction of the waterfront. Jacob slapped his legs, crouched down, and whistled. Finally he coaxed the dog back to his side. When they reached Market Street, Jacob picked up the dog and carried it in his arms for a few blocks. It was so fidgety, Jacob was afraid it might dash under the wheels of a wagon. The sky lightened from a charcoal to smoky gray, and the street lights began to dim. As Jacob hurried toward the produce district, the dog, squirming, became frantic. It thrust its hind legs against Jacob's chest and leaped. When it hit the ground, it let out a loud, shrill yelp. "What's wrong, fella?" Jacob said. "We're going to see Uncle Abe. Come on." The dog ran a few yards towards the docks, then turned and barked again. "Not down there, fella," Jacob said. "This way." He trotted up the hill toward the produce district. The dog stood undecided. Over his shoulder, Jacob coaxed, "Come on, fella, this way." At last the dog padded to Jacob. Side by side they ran the rest of the way to Washington Street. The produce district was already alive with activity. Jacob saw horses tethered to wooden wagons standing alone along both sides of the street. Men in overalls were unloading crates and sacks. Jacob breathed in the earthy smells of soil and horseflesh. He passed a wagon heaped high with bulging bags of potatoes and onions. A merchant rushed toward him carrying a stack of egg cartons, and Jacob stepped aside to let the man pass. As Jacob hurried toward the spot where his Uncle Abe always set up his cart, he started to feel dizzy. His stomach churned, and he thought he was going to be sick. Jacob wondered if Papa was right and the dog had been troubling because of a disease. The ground began to sway. Bending his knees, Jacob tried to ride the movement. The street heaved and rolled like the ocean during a storm. It was as though a giant sleeping below the cobblestones had suddenly decided to get up. Buildings began weaving in and out, and the street pitched like an angry sea. Jacob took a step and fell forward and fell. He heard a wagon overturn and crates thud to the ground. Rising himself on all fours, he tried to make sense of what was happening. "This is an earthquake," he realized. "It'll be over in a few seconds." Jacob remembered several earthquakes and how the ground had seemed to roll. Sometimes dishes had fallen off shelves, but in an instant the quakes had been over. The street continued to heave and roll. Jacob's ears filled with a roar as loud as thunder. In the gray light he saw the cobblestone street split down the middle. A ditch several feet across opened. As Jacob watched, the ditch yawned wide, thinned to a split, and gaped apart again. Bricks were raining all over the street. The roar was deafening. "I've got to get under something," Jacob thought. Holding his arms over his head, he rushed toward an open building. He stumbled, then forced himself upright. Something rammed against his legs, and Jacob saw the dog. He could see its mouth moving up and down, but he could not hear its barking. Jacob tried to make its way toward the building again, but the dog tripped him. Frantic, Jacob changed direction and ran toward the other side of the street. A great cracking noise came from behind him. He whirled in time to see the front wall of the building collapse in a heap. The air filled with clouds of dust. All along the street buildings rattled and lurched. Chunks of masonry hit the ground and broke into pieces. Window glass shattered. The columns of a nearby building buckled and crashed. Carts overturned, littering the sides of the street, and frantic horses struggled to free themselves from their reins. The dog jumped on Jacob's thigh, pushing him backwards against the collapsed wagon. A pair of horses stampeded through the street toward them. They dragged a broken cart, which lurched from side to side and slammed into piles of fallen bricks. Jacob could feel his heart pounding inside his chest as he squeezed himself against the side of the heavy wagon, hoping it would give him some protection. He reached for the dog and held its trembling body close to his chest. The crazed horses careened by, missing them by just a few feet. The roaring drowned all other sounds. Crouching beside the wagon, holding tight to the dog, Jacob watched the cobblestones vibrate and buildings cave in. The ground shook with such violence that Jacob thought the world was coming to an end.